So now, our guest of honor. Dave DeSteno is professor of psychology at Northeastern University, where he directs the social emotions group. At the broadest level, his work examines the mechanisms of the mind that shape vice and virtue. Studying hypocrisy and compassion, pride and punishment, cheating and trust, his work continually reveals that human moral behavior is much more variable than most would predict. Dave is a fellow of the Association for Psychological Science and the American Psychological Association, for which he served as editor-in-chief of the journal Emotion. His work has been repeatedly funded by the National Science Foundation, has been regularly featured in the media, including in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, CBS Sunday Morning, NPR's Radio Lab, On Point, and USA Today. He's the author of this book right here, which I highly recommend to everyone if you haven't yet read it already, How God Works, which is going to be the subject of our conversation tonight, as well as the books Emotional Success, The Truth About Trust, and he's the co-author of the Wall Street Journal Spotlight Psychology bestseller, Out of Character. He frequently writes about his work for major publications, including the New York Times, The Atlantic, Harvard Business Review, The Washington Post, and the Los Angeles Times. He received his PhD in psychology from Yale University, and we're very privileged to have you here today. Thank you for joining us tonight, and start off by telling us a little bit of how does a scientist wind up studying religion?
Sure. Well, first, thank you all for inviting me here. Thank you, Mitch, for inviting me here. It's my pleasure and honor to be with you, and I appreciate you coming on such a beautiful day as this. Yeah, it's a good question. When I was an undergraduate, so I was raised Catholic, from which I've lapsed. But when I was an undergraduate, I was trying to decide between being a psychologist or studying the history of religions, because I was always quite interested in the big questions. That is, what makes you a good person? What do we owe to one another? Is there a higher power? And I went back and forth, and ultimately I decided to be a psychologist because for all of those questions, except the one about is there a higher power, I could actually run experiments and get some answers rather than just debating things in a way that seemed to go in circles. And so I spent my time as a scientist studying things like, as Mitch said, I study people's virtues, I study their emotions, and a lot of things we studied were things like gratitude, things like mindfulness. And every time we studied something, I thought, oh look, I found a way to make people happier, to make people kinder, to make people more generous. And then I would look around and realize that I had been scooped by millennia, that there were spiritual traditions from all over the world who are making good use of these things. That's always humbling for a scientist. And then I looked at the data, and this isn't my data, this is epidemiological data. People who are actively engaged in religious practice, so saying you believe in God doesn't account for much in terms of your health outcomes, but regularly attending services, being engaged in religious practices, those people live longer, healthier, and happier lives at all stages. You know, even now there's epidemiological data suggesting that even among the younger generation, Generation Z, who we keep seeing spiking depression and suicide rates and stress in, those who are engaged in a religious upbringing, it doesn't really matter the dogma, it matters that they are engaged in the practices and with the community, have more resilience. And so as a scientist, to me that says there's something there. And so I'm in no way an apologist for religion. Religious institutions, like any other institutions or ideologies, can be twisted for different purposes. But it would be strange if thousands of years of thought that was focused on helping people meet life's challenges didn't have something to offer. And so I spend my time among some of my scientific friends saying that, you know, let's not make a caricature out of religion. Let's not assume it's all superstition and pick the cases where people are anti-science. Because I don't think that's where most people are. Most people, I think, as Rabbi Jeff said, we're trying to deal with human questions. And so what we'll talk about tonight is the wisdom of religious practices. You know, I like to think of it in terms of, in the 1950s, when the pharmaceutical companies were looking for new ways to create new drugs, they did something called bioprospecting. That is, they went to traditional cultures and said, what medicines do you have? And sure, a lot of them didn't do anything, but some did. And from that, we found amazing medications. And so given the data that we have that engagement in spiritual practices makes people live healthier, happier lives, let's study those practices. Let's stop debating whether God exists. I can't tell you if the practices come from a God, he, she, or it, who loves their creations and cares for them, or from people figuring stuff out over millennia. But I can tell you they work. And we've kind of done this with meditation as a society. You see mindfulness everywhere, although it's been corporatized in some ways, and we can talk about that. But I think there's a lot more to learn. And so I've been grateful for my partnership with Rabbi Middleman, with whom I've worked and who I've learned a lot as we're trying to kind of understand how we can put science and religion together and to understand how it makes life better for people. So that's how I am where I am.
Still work to do.
Yeah.
So we're sitting here in Dweck Sanctuary, so I think we should start by talking about prayer. Prayer being something that's so central to Jewish life, it's really a cornerstone of what we do in the American synagogue. It's also very challenging because we do it in a language that not all of us are necessarily fluent in. And even if we have fluency with the language, sometimes the content of prayer itself is difficult to connect with. So you talk about prayer as a technology. How does that technology work? What are the benefits of a regular cycle of prayer?
Yeah, I think it can happen in many ways. One of the challenges with prayer, and as I told Mitch, please correct me if I mispronounce things, right? There is the Keva, right, which is the actual saying of the prayer. And, I was raised Catholic, but it's a similar thing in that I could sit in church and I could recite the prayers by rote, which kind of means I could do them while I was daydreaming, which kind of means they weren't doing much for me. Then I learned from Jeff the word kavanah, which is the intention, when you feel moved by it. And I think the trick with prayer is, in the way it's done in many religions, is there is the routinization element of it. And as a psychologist, I can tell you the routinization of it, when you understand the words, can actually help make a habit of things. If I think I should act a certain way, that's useful. It will shape my thoughts. But it's all the other things that are going on when we pray together that really do a lot. So when we're together in congregation, as you're sitting there with people around you, what's happening unbeknownst to you is that your heart rates are beginning to synchronize. Your breathing will synchronize to those people who are around you. When you pray together, say the same words together in different religions, people will sit and stand and kneel together. Whatever we do in synchrony creates a bond between people. And you might say, well, how do you know that? Well, we tried to study this in my lab thinking nothing about religion. We figured that, in the old days, if you looked in the sky, well, even now you will see, if you see a flock of birds or a school of fish, if they're moving together, it's an ancient signal that these have become one. And so we did a study in my lab where we simply brought people together and we had them put on earphones, and it made beats in their ears that they could hear tones, and they had to tap a sensor on the table. And for some of the people, they did it together. They were synchronized beats. For other people, they were asynchronous. They were just completely out of synchrony with each other. And then after that, to make a long story short, we had one of the people get stuck doing this long, onerous, laborious task, which no one liked, of course. It was structured to be like that. And then we asked the other person if they wanted to help. And what we found is if you had simply tapped your hands together in time, people reported feeling more similar to the other person. And they'd say things like, I think they were in my class last semester. These are college students, right? They were at a party I was at. None of that was true because we hired actors to do this. But they felt more similar. They felt more connected. They felt more compassion for the person's plight. And 30% more of them actually said, yeah, you know what? I will help this person. I'll take some of their labor. And so prayer, if you do it together, it actually, the simple act of it makes us feel closer, makes us feel more like a community. The other thing that's interesting about it is how do we get to the intention, to the kavanah? And I was talking with Marnie a little bit ago, and she was saying in some congregations at times, people will, sing together. If you don't know the words, hum. And it reminded me of this tradition of singing niguns or nigunim. And it is a way to actually pray without words, right? You are chanting these tunes and these melodies. And there's been a lot of work on this too. And what it does is it creates in people a deep sense of connection, and they build off one another. And it makes people report feeling greater connection to each other and greater connection to the divine. And so there's lots of ways that prayer interacts with us. Another one that Jeff and I are actually working on is I can't say it. How do you pronounce it?
The Birchot HaShachar.
The Birchot HaShachar, and then
the early morning blessings.
The early blessings and the repeated blessings throughout the day. What are those? Those are really things that you give thanks to God, and if you're feeling them, if you're feeling the kavanah, you're feeling gratitude, right? And so the trick is not to do them by rote, which a lot of us do, but to take a moment and to pause. When you feel gratitude, what we know scientifically is it reduces your stress, it makes you happier, it makes you more generous, it makes you more honest, it makes you more willing to help other people. And we have all kinds of studies showing this, where we make people feel this emotion and give them the opportunity to cheat or give them the opportunity to help other people. And we can see the changes. And so prayer in many ways is a technology that serves many purposes. It brings your intention to what the teachings of your religion are. But at the same time, it's building community if you're doing it together. And this is one of the hard things when we were all on Zoom, right? We weren't co-present with each other. And so these ancient rituals that have been developed over millennia for people together, because there was no Zoom, there was no computer. The question now is, how are they going to work when we're in a world where we're becoming more digital? And the answer is we don't know. But I think in all of those ways, prayer is just one of those technologies that is pushing your mind and your body on different levels. And there's a wisdom in the way we do it.
The question that I have I think you're a little bit preaching to the choir, because some of these are regulars. So people are here on Shabbat, or people here for daily services, and a little bit you answered it when you talked about the study that you're about to do with Birchot HaShachar, because that's a prayer that you do it's a series of blessings that you recite every day. Is there a magic number? Is there a certain amount of time that you have to do this, or on a certain frequency where it actually starts to work?
It's a good question. We don't know. We're going to look at that. But the trick, right, is if you ask people, what are you grateful for? We were talking about this before. People say, oh, my family, my friends, my health. Those are great. You should be grateful for those things if you're fortunate enough to have them. But what we know from behavioral science research is people habituate to things. And so if you say every day, oh, I'm grateful for this or for that, it can become kind of stale. And if you're not feeling the emotion, if you're doing it by rote, it's a problem. And so the question is, how do you get the feeling? How do you get the intention? How do you get the kavanah? It's to be more mindful about it. You hear about mindfulness all the time, right? But mindfulness isn't just a Buddhist practice. Sure, in some ways, the meditation that the apps teach you is derived from Buddhist teaching. But it's to pause, right? And it's to think of and to reflect on those things that you're thinking about. You don't need an hour. You need 2 minutes. And so I would encourage everyone to make it a mindfulness practice as opposed to a routine one. And to find, the other thing, I've learned this from Jeff as well, is one of the wonderful things about being people of the book is that you have prayers for many, many things. And sometimes the hardest thing is to find the right words that meet the moment. And if you have them, you can go through your day, and whether it's a beautiful sunset or someone you know feeling better or a beautiful meal or whatever it might be, find those words and embrace that for a minute or two. And what you're really doing then is you're microdosing little bits of gratitude. And we know that's good for your body and it's good for your well-being. So to answer your question, we don't know the perfect number, but we know more is better.
Did everybody hear that? More is better. Right? So, like an advertisement for coming to shul. But speaking of prayers, so as Jews, we technically could pray anywhere. It doesn't have to physically be in a synagogue space. We could pray wherever we'd like. But we know that more often than not, for most people, prayer takes place in a sanctuary like the one that we're sitting in. And sanctuaries might be different from one synagogue to the next, but generally speaking, they have similar features. They're laid out a certain way. When we're not sitting here talking to each other, this is where the reader's table is, where this cantor leads the service from, and from where the Torah is read on Shabbat. All Jewish synagogues have an ark, as the one behind us, with a ner tamid, an eternal flame. What is it about the sort of atmosphere in which people pray that sort of adds to the experience of prayer compared to just being in your kitchen or living room?
Yeah, it's a good question. If you think about, and I don't know synagogues that well, so you can tell me, but if you think about a lot of worship spaces, the ones that I'm familiar with tend to kind of be larger rooms, halls with high ceilings many times. A lot of the goal is to give people a sense of smallness, a sense of kind of awe and appreciation of something greater. People oftentimes, if you're walking amongst the redwoods or the Grand Canyon, people will have this experience of awe, right, at nature's beauty. And for many people, they'll say that's a spiritual experience. What we know about the architecture of sacred spaces is they try to evoke that a little bit in and of themselves. There's a lot of work on the feeling of having even minor bits of feeling kind of awe. It makes you feel small. It makes you experience wonder a bit more. And there's even a great study that shows if you take people who are very secularly oriented and you let them experience awe in nature's beauty or in a beautiful space, and you ask them questions about how likely is it that there is God or there is a supernatural force guiding the world, it nudges up a little bit. And so that feeling you have is putting you in a state where you're more open to wonder, to God. It also is, they're usually quiet spaces. What we know, when the body feels quiet, so you have two, to make a long, complicated story short, there are basically two branches of the nervous system. And when you are in a quiet place and you feel safe, you tend to get greater activation of your vagus nerve, which slows down your breathing, which slows down your heart rate, which also makes you more open to connection and to each other. And people feel that more when they're in an enclosed space, but that's very large. No one likes to feel constrained. It's also a space that has items in it typically that are spiritually oriented that attunes you. And so what you're seeing in sacred spaces is an architecture that makes you feel usually a bit smaller, by having an open space, that makes you feel a bit of awe by that open space, especially if it's a beautiful one. And it's making you open to those around you, and it's making you open to the idea of the divine and more accepting of the lessons that are coming from the space. So yes, you can pray everywhere, but it's all about getting your mind and body in a state where it's more receptive to it.
So for those who may not have read the book yet, one of the features is that Dave goes through some of the life cycles and identifies certain rituals and different traditions and how those rituals stand out as being particularly efficacious in helping people get through a particular time in their life. So in the discussion about coming-of-age rituals, which happens a lot in this room with bar and bat mitzvahs, but with coming-of-age rituals, you write about two psychological levers, the self-control and also this self-fulfilling prophecy. So how do these two levers work, and how do they work specifically when it comes to coming-of-age rites?
Yeah, so if you are becoming an adult, one of the things you have to prove to other people in your community is that they can rely on you. And the way, psychologically speaking, that we learn that we can rely on somebody is that they show some degree of self-control, ability to control their impulses. And so in many indigenous cultures, what you often see in rites of passage are people endure pain. There are tribes in the Amazon where they will put their hands in these gloves that are weaved with what are called bullet ants. And they're called bullet ants because the sting has the pain intensity of being shot. And so they will do that and they can't cry out. In the Maasai in Africa, it's a similar thing. They will go through certain rituals that are extremely painful. And they have to show that they are not, that they cannot show pain. The Native, or not react to it, the Native Americans the women will do what's called the sunrise ceremony, where they will dance for hours and hours and can't stop. And these are basically ways to show the community that you have fortitude, that you have self-control, and also to convince yourself that you can do it. As societies became more urbanized, and what mattered for success wasn't so much your ability to endure the pain that life brings you, but to basically show that you had self-control, but to basically develop skills that were more relevant to urban society. Things like book knowledge or being an honest person, showing good virtue. It began to change. And so in many traditions now, and I think this is part of bar mitzvahs, right? Part of what you have to do is a lot of study. And then that takes, I have not gone to Hebrew school, but I can imagine it takes a lot of devotion and effort to learn this language and then to stand up in front of everyone, to give a reading, to give a drasha, to show that you have developed a competence. And in many ways, these types of ceremonies are now taking the place of rites of passage. It's funny, I remember when I was learning about bar mitzvahs, it seemed that they have developed over time. And for early on in Jewish history, when, at that point it was a boy, when he turned 13, it was basically the father said something like, "Thank you, God, for relieving me for being responsible for this kid." Right? And that was basically it. But then it developed into what it is now, which is not just, okay, this boy has reached a certain age, or now this girl has reached a certain age where they can take part in certain religious rituals, but they have to show their competence, their drive. And so I think that's what's happening now. But there's also this part of the self-fulfilling prophecy. Once somebody has their bar mitzvah, and I'll focus on that for now, suddenly they can do many different things. They can be part of a minyan. They can say certain prayers. Because part of the complexity in becoming an adult is you have to show that you have the skills, but we all doubt ourselves. And so the community has to keep reinforcing it. If the community around you starts treating you like, if you have your bar mitzvah one day and they start treating you like a kid the day after again, you're going to fall back into it. But suddenly, if you can now have additional responsibilities, that's a message to you that the community around you expects you to be an adult. They're treating you that way. And it becomes what we in psychology call a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you believe something is likely to happen, it is more likely to happen because you will unconsciously behave in ways that make you conform to that.
I think we're very good at the self-control piece, in the sense that we do expect a lot of our students to achieve. You have me thinking about what's the piece of the self-fulfilling prophecy. Like, are we asking enough of our students in terms of how we treat them afterwards, right? Like, do we give them enough leadership roles? Do we sort of put them in the position to actually demonstrate what they've done, other than sort of in that one morning or that one afternoon?
Well, and I think that's the trick, right? So in many more indigenous societies, in the Maasai, after you survive that ceremony, you got a bunch of cows. And they were your responsibility, and you got land, and you did this. When you were in tribes in South America, suddenly you were now going to battle when they were into tribal warfare. And so I think that is part of it. The joke, right, that I hear, right, is that there's more bar than mitzvah in bar mitzvah these days. And so same thing in Catholic Church. So I had confirmation, which is it's not exactly similar, but nothing changed that much for me after. And I think this is the question that we're all dealing with now, in how to, there's a big debate going on. And I don't have the answer to it, and I don't really have a side to it because I think it's a complex issue, but are we coddling teens too much? Are we protecting them too much? Is there helicopter parenting or lawnmower parenting, as it's called now? Is that good? Is that bad? It's clear that adolescence has become longer for people. Whether or not that's a good thing or a bad thing, we don't know, because lives have become longer. The lifespan is longer than it was. And so maybe it's okay not to grow up that quickly. But I think it is important for us to think about, if we want kids to have that sense of self-reliance and self-confidence, then as you said, we do need to expect more and treat them that way. Because if we're not, we're giving them mixed signals. Sure, you're an adult. Yeah. Let me take care of that for you. And I think it's an issue we're all struggling with right now.
My kids are still young, but I'm thinking about the whole parenting thing and how much of that how much do you cuddle and how much do you really let them figure it out on their own or expect them to sort of rise to the occasion. So and I guess going along with that idea that everything is sort of being stretched out now, lifespans being stretched out, adolescence being stretched out. If we're going to talk about, and you talk a little bit in the book about sort of constructing rituals, and you use the example of scouting and merit badges, that like you take small steps, it's not this giant leap. And yet, often in the religious space, we talk about sort of the leap of faith. And I guess to a degree in Judaism, we think about, or we expect that in terms of actions as well. Like that suddenly, I had these conversations with our B'nai Mitzvah students all the time, that suddenly they become 13 and it's no longer their parents' responsibility for them to fulfill mitzvot, it's theirs. But that we know that that's not the reality, that it doesn't change overnight. So how do you construct ritual, or what's the benefit of constructing ritual where you're sort of gradually taking steps and working up towards something compared to asking for this sort of giant leap to demonstrate one's competence or abilities?
Yeah, the reason I use the analogy to scouting is that basically, for those of you who know anything about scouting, and they've had their problems too as an organization, but in terms of the progression to Eagle Scout, you can think about that as a secular coming of age, right? It is true that people who have reached Eagle Scout status, it is something that employers like. It is something that they've shown a lot of effort and motivation to do, and they've earned merit badges along the way. What are merit badges? They are markers that you have certain competencies. And what we know about the brain, right, is it's not one day it's an adult brain. Adolescence is a period of rewiring and growth and change. And one thing we know about adolescents' brains is they're very attuned to social feedback. Right? Why, in some ways, is social media hitting adolescents so hard? Well, yes, they use their phones more, but they care a lot more about what other people think of them. In fact, there have been studies that show they will pay money even to get negative feedback because they just want to know what you think. And biologically, it makes sense. If you're coming of age in a society and you want to fit in with that society, you want to be attuned to what that society values, because that's how you're going to earn your place in it. And so biologically, it makes sense. But different competencies come online. I mean, if you think about it, we can vote when we're 18, but we can't drink till we're 21. You can be bar mitzvahed when you're 13. There's not one magical age. And even when I told you about those bullet ant rituals, it's not like they do it once. They do this many times over a couple of years. And it's reinforcing the idea of growth. And so I think what might be a better way to do it is to have different steps along the way where people can meet certain goals, and there can be a community showing some acknowledgement of it, and then we move forward. Because the once and done, it's hard to perpetuate something when it's once and done, rather than building up slowly. And what those mileposts are going to be and when anybody is ready for them may change by community, it may change by person. One person may be ready when they're 13, one when they're 15. And if you target it to when they are kind of biologically and psychologically ready, it's going to be a more lasting, a more impactful way to do it. I think the reason a lot of religions don't do that is because they're very much focused on, can you participate in the kind of religious aspects? Can you say certain prayers? If you're Catholic, can you receive communion? Can you do different things? But in a lot of the world, religion permeates a lot more aspects of life, especially in more indigenous societies. And can we actually incorporate those mileposts, more mileposts for adolescents along the way? I think that would help. I mean, you say that it's at 13, we say you're an adult, but the reality is it doesn't really work that way. So how do you handle that?
I mean, that's right. All the kids, I always ask them as a joke, right? Are you going to start paying rent the day after your bar mitzvah? Are you going to get a job, right? So there is a little bit of, right, we're telling them they're an adult, but only in certain circumstances and only with these particular parameters, and we don't necessarily reinforce it or ask that much of them.
No.
But,
and society or outside doesn't treat them like an adult at 13.
Right, nothing really changes for them at school, nothing. That's true, right.
And so it's kind of a mishmash.
The bar bat mitzvah thing is, we're still figuring it out. But one of the things we have figured out, I think, and you reference this in the book at the end, is death and dying. That Jews are good about the whole mourning piece of all of this. But before we get to what happens sort of for those who survive, who are mourning the loss of somebody else, what are the benefits of believing in some sort of version of an afterlife or having some understanding that consciousness goes even beyond our death? What is it that helps to make that transition easier for a person who's approaching that moment, who's aware of that?
Yeah, so first I'll give you the lay of the land. So if you ask people how anxious they are about dying, what you see is kind of it looks kind of like this. It's how can I say this? So if you have a continuum from people who are kind of hardcore atheists and believe there's no way there's anything after death, to people who are kind of unsure, to people who fervently believe that there is an afterlife, the people who are the most anxious about death are the people who don't know. Because the atheists are like, I'm going to be in a box, I'm going to die, that's it. They're still more anxious about death than the people who firmly believe that life goes on. But the people who are the most anxious, the people who don't really know. Because uncertainty is just never a good thing. And there's always the question, if I don't really know, am I doing the right thing to prepare myself? To be completely honest, as a scientist, I don't know what happens. And any scientist who tells you they know what happens shouldn't be saying that. You know, we can say we have no evidence that life goes on after death, but we had no evidence for quantum entanglement 10 years ago, 20 years ago. So I don't like to question people's belief about that because it would be hubristic of me. I don't know. But we do know that to the extent you believe that life goes on in some sense, there is a reduction in anxiety around death. And so in some ways, and you see it in all religions, I mean, even in religions that believe in reincarnation or nirvana and merging with something greater, there is this sense of you that goes on. And it is a comforting thought. I think it's a comforting thought for people to even think about their relatives who have gone on. In China, they have a tradition called ghost money, where they will burn paper money, it's fake, it's not actual currency, for their relatives who have passed because it gives them money to spend in the afterlife. And you might say, well, that sounds kind of silly. Why would you do that? But what it's really doing is it's allowing them to think about this person who has passed, to remember what it is they liked and what they might want to spend their money on, and to have a feeling of connection with them that continues. I know in your tradition there's how does the yard site work?
The anniversary of the death.
It's the anniversary of the death.
So you show up in the synagogue for the service, and you recite the mourner's Kaddish. That's what we talked about before.
Yeah. Is it on? Do you do it monthly or just on the anniversary?
Just on, so the different stages of mourning. Yeah. So the intensive 7-day period of Shiva is only at home, technically, and then the Shloshim period of the 30 days which follow, you come back to the synagogue to recite the prayer, and it's on a daily basis. And for the first year, if you're mourning a parent, you continue to recite the Kaddish on a daily basis. And then once that first yard site has passed, the first year, you only say the Kaddish on the yard site itself, on the anniversary of death. There's a couple of holidays that you also do it, but then you're only doing it once a year and always on the Hebrew anniversary of their passing.
Yeah, and you're remembering them, but in remembering them, what you're really doing is kind of making them real again. And so I just think if we don't know, then is there any harm in believing it? You know, I always argue with my friend Steve Pinker. He's like, Dave, there is no afterlife. It's superstition, and it devalues life on Earth. And I say, Steve, if it actually did devalue life on Earth, then I would be with you, right? If it were the case that people who believed in an afterlife didn't take care of themselves here because they're like, I just want to go to heaven, or in your tradition, whatever it might be, I'd say, well, you might have a point. But as I just told you, people who are religious, who do believe in an afterlife, unless, you know, there are certain aspects of hardcore religion where people will try and hasten that, but for most people that's not the case. Those people take better care of themselves. They live better lives. They're happier. There is no harm in it. And so if we don't know what the answer is, why are we going to try and argue about it and convince ourselves that it's not true? Again, that's not to say from a scientific sense that there's any proof of it. But my sense is if there's no proof of it and it's not doing harm but doing good, why say definitively it's silly to believe in?
I want to go back to what you just, when you talked about people coming and remembering their loved one, remembering is making them real again. Mm-hmm. That's a very powerful image because, I mean, we're going to do this weekend. 3 times a year, really 4 times a year, we recite Yizkor prayers, the sort of the memorial prayer on all of the major holidays. And so the whole point is that people come back, anybody who's lost a loved one, they come to services and they recite a prayer in memory of a loved one who they've lost, whether it's a year ago or 20 years ago or more. And we always sort of precede that service with a sermon, which is, and the word Yizkor it means to remember. And so that's sort of the goal of what we're trying to do all of the time, is you're sort of reaching back into the past and remembering someone and trying to bring that into the present to make it real again. I think it's a very powerful way. You said it, but I'm going to use it on Saturday when I talk about it.
Yeah, and, you know, it's funny. I was on my podcast. I had Rabbi Angela Bookdahl on, and we were talking about, and we'll talk about Shiva in a minute. And she recited, and I can't do it justice, but this beautiful midrash teaching about 2 boats. One was leaving the harbor on its maiden voyage to go out and explore the world. You can think of that as birth. And there was an old ship that had survived the seas and gone everywhere and was coming back to be decommissioned. And the reason, and shouldn't we celebrate that had seen and lived a wonderful life and whose time had come? And the reason she was telling the story is because I asked her, I'm like, well, why do you celebrate the death date? Why don't you celebrate the birth date, right, for the arts? Isn't that kind of morbid? And she was telling no. And she's absolutely right, because what you're doing is honoring that life that has come to fulfillment, hopefully, not all do, and its end, and celebrating that. And when we talk about Shiva, I'll tell you a little bit more about why making that person feel real again, what the psychological benefits are.
And there's tangible components to the yard site as well, other than coming out and showing up in synagogue and reciting Kaddish. It's encouraged that people give tzedakah, that they give a donation to charity on that time. So there's a way to also sort of take the theoretical and what you're thinking and feeling and also translate that into real concrete action. So speaking of sort of the morning rituals, well, let's talk about Shiva a little bit, because I like that, you know, so I was like proud of us as Jews when I read the part in the book that says, like, you know, Jews do Shiva is like a great ritual for managing grief and mourning. And we had a workshop a couple of weeks ago in the congregation with a social worker who helped us sort of dispel that notion that grief happens in these linear stages and that we all go through them the same way. And we talked about, you know, it's really not that line. It's more like you sort of like a jumble going back and forth from one stage to the other. You may not even hit certain stages at any point. Yeah. But how do rituals, whether it's Jewish ones or the others that you talk about in the book, how do rituals related to grief and mourning really help us navigate those various stages that people might go through during that time?
Yeah, so let's set the stage first. You've probably all heard about the 5 stages of grief. There is no scientific evidence in any way that supports the 5 stages of grief. People like a roadmap, and so they've latched onto this roadmap. I think in some ways that's why Shiva works so well, because it is a roadmap for mourners on how to mourn in a way that's productive. But there is no evidence for that. If we look at the evidence of how people grieve, there are 3 main trajectories in the way people move through grief. The first is about maybe like 65, 70% of people, which is called the resilient trajectory. When someone dies, you experience that pain, you experience that grief. It's for a relatively short time. And in a month or two, you're able to kind of reintegrate in society. It's not that you repress the grief, but it doesn't prevent you from functioning. There's another trajectory that is called chronic grief. And chronic grief, this is about 10% of people, where they get stuck in the grief and can't end it. And so it is in many ways paralyzing and impacts them for years at a time. And then there's another one called common grief, which lasts longer than the resilient period. It'll last typically about 6 months, during which time a lot of people are really impacted to the sense that, clinical depression rises, they can't really function very well, and they will return to baseline ultimately. But the trick with dealing with grief isn't to repress it. It is to move through it in a way that it does not become too intense or go on too long. Because everybody grieves in their own way. And a lot of this work was done by the psychologist George Bonanno at Columbia University. And he told me when he first started studying how people move through grief, I said to him, George, do people really want to come and talk to you about their grief? Because they're grieving. And he said a lot of people did, because they felt like they weren't going through the 5 stages of grief. And so they thought they were doing something wrong, right? Or they weren't grieving the right way, or something was wrong with them. And they wanted to tell me what they were really feeling. And when I look at Shiva, it is an amazing package of just the right things to help people move through grief. So the one thing that all religions do when somebody passes is we eulogize them, right? We talk about why they were a wonderful person. And you might say, well, yeah, what's so special about that? That makes sense. It doesn't really make sense, because if you just lost a job that you loved, or your spouse who you loved dearly just left you, you wouldn't want to think about them all the time, because it would hurt to think about that job you were fired from, or that person, or your spouse who's now gone on to marry someone else. But what we know about people who have died is forming a positive memory, consolidating a positive memory about them, is one of the biggest predictors of who moves through grief in a positive way, because it becomes very comforting. And so it's the reason that all religions foster eulogizing. But then here's where Shiva is different. And you know this far better than I do. I have not been to a Shiva, so I feel like I'm preaching to the choir. But let me tell you about the way I understand it works. Immediately, the community goes into action. Everybody knows what they have to do. And so in that first few days, is it Onim? What is it? Yeah. Onim, right? You have no responsibility except to prepare things, get ready for the final decisions that you have to make. And then in the 7-day mourning period, people show up, right? It is a mitzvah, right? You have to come. It's not like, yeah, it'd be nice if I go and visit Mary, whose parent died. You have to go. You bring food. You provide other types of support. That's called instrumental support. That is another big predictor. It's not like sending a like on Facebook, right? It's who shows up to help you when you need it and be there. Another big predictor. You cover your mirrors, right? In Hinduism, they cover their mirrors. In Irish Catholic wakes, they cover their mirrors. But in Shiva, it's a big thing. You cover your mirrors. You don't focus on your own appearance, right? Traditionally, people would tear their clothes. Now you might wear the kriya, right, just the ribbon. What does reducing self-focus do? Well, one thing, there's a ton of psychological studies that if we sit you in front of a mirror and we show you your face, whatever emotion you're feeling intensifies. If you're feeling happy, you feel happier. If you're feeling sad, you feel sadder. If you're grieving, you feel that grief more intensely. And so by reducing self-focus, by not worrying about how you're dressing or not shaving or covering your mirrors, you're reducing a focus on your own appearance and your own self. That in and of itself reduces grief. You sit on low stools. You sit on the floor. I have not done this, but my imagination of this, just from ergonomics, is that after a while, sitting that way can be a little uncomfortable. What we know is that when you have mild onsets and offsets of comfort and discomfort, biologically that causes a reduction in grieving and rumination. And so here's another way of doing that. You have to have 10 people at least together to recite. Does everybody recite the Kaddish or just the mourner? But do they say other prayers together? Or the rest of the prayers are together. And so whether you're doing that, and if you're doing it together, I don't know, do people shuckle when they do this, right?
Depends on what community.
Depends on the community, right? Again, that is the synchrony. We're saying things together, we're praying together, we're perhaps moving together. That is scientifically shown to make us have more empathy and compassion for each other. We do that. Perfect. After the 7 days, right, you go into shloshim, and there's a mild or a prolonged integration back into society. My favorite example of that in other places is in Victorian England. They used to have this tradition where when somebody died, everybody would wear black. And then what would happen is, over time, you would go from black to gray clothing to violet clothing until you got back to light clothing. And what it was a way of showing other people where you were in the mourning period, right? So they didn't come up to you and be like, hey, how's it going? Let's go out for a drink or whatever it might be. It was marking where you were to other people and to yourself. And in some senses, Shloshim does that as well. And then, as you're saying, the yard site is a way for commemorating that person, for consolidating that positive memory of that person. And it doesn't, for most people, for some it will, but for most it doesn't cause more grief. As I said, consolidating that positive memory reduces grief, makes you feel closer to that person, makes them feel real again. One of the things that's so hard when somebody dies is you know this person and suddenly they're not there anymore, and your brain is not used to that. And so by making them real, even if only in your memory, it helps you just consolidate those wonderful views about them. George Bonanno, whose work this is on grief, likes to tell the story of C.S. Lewis, where he said when I think it was his wife, when his wife first passed, he felt like he couldn't even picture her anymore. He couldn't even put the pieces of her together. And it was only over time that he was able to do that. And when he did that, it brought him kind of comfort and joy. And so what you're finding in the eulogizing and the coming together is helping to rebuild that positive memory of that person who has passed. And psychologically, that helps us deal with grief.
I want to come back to the piece about the mirrors, because I hadn't thought about. Of course, I've always learned we always teach it as you cover the mirrors to diminish your own sort of concern with your own appearance, but I don't usually share the psychological piece because I didn't know that until you just shared it. But this idea that so you're reinforced by whatever you're seeing from yourself, being reflected back. On a somewhat different topic, but related to this idea of seeing yourself, I learned during COVID when I was on all these 9 million Zoom calls a day, you can turn off the self-view feature. So you don't see yourself on the Zoom call. So you see all these other people, but there's a way to turn it off so you don't see yourself. And I was reading that it's actually, it's exhausting to watch yourself on the call, because rather than paying attention to the other people who you're trying to communicate with, you keep looking at yourself. And you're checking, like, am I smiling enough? Are my eyes bright enough? Did I miss something in my teeth? Like, it's so consuming to be on that call. And so it wound up like we were already so exhausted because of staring at screens all day, and it was only exacerbating that exhaustion by constantly looking basically at a mirror for the entire day.
And this is the hard part, right? As we move to a more digital society, these practices that have been developed over thousands of years may not translate for that very reason. Right? Now, I'm sure if it was better to have people around you on Zoom during Shiva than to be alone. But was it distracting? No. No. But seeing yourself there, in some senses, does exactly what you're saying. It's counterproductive. Now, there were theological reasons, right, for why covering mirrors worked. What we don't really know is which came first, or do we? I mean, in some ways, right, people will find something that works and let's create a reason for why it works. But when I look at religions across different traditions, you can see certain elements, kind of like convergent evolution, appearing in them, because they're, we all talk about life hacks. Give me a life hack to help me save money. Give me a life hack to lose weight. Yeah, well, that's great. They work. But what these practices are life hacks that have been honed and packaged together in very sophisticated ways over millennia. Does every ritual have a power? No. But do many of them? Yes. And they're pinging our minds and our bodies in ways that, our ancestors couldn't run randomized control trials and understand how and why they worked, but they did. And there was, Jeff, what's the word for when things kind of, it's not like a kludge, but when the things kind of like come together and there's no like long tradition behind them? You were telling me that sometimes in the development of practices, they were just kind of, yeah, I wish I could remember what you told me one time. You said it in a more sophisticated way. Like there wasn't there's not always a sophisticated theology behind the way certain practices are put together. It's kind of what worked.
Oh, yeah.
I'll have to think back.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that I think related to we just mentioned the Zoom Shiva, and I think for many people, we talked about this at our last Scientists in Synagogues session. We talked about sort of what were the COVID keepers? What are the things that we did differently during COVID that actually work and that are sticking around, just based anecdotally for us, what's working. One of the things that's not a COVID keeper, I think, is the Zoom Shiva. We do plenty of Shiva Minyanim. What very rarely now, in the past year, have people said, oh, can you also set up a Zoom link for us to do it? It happens so infrequently that I think a lot of people said, well, if I don't have to do that, if I can gather in person with family and friends, I'd rather that than some sort of Zoom alternative that's maybe not even second best, but somewhere down on the list. Are there maybe the reason, I'm sure this is like sort of still being figured out, but what are the things that you might imagine that the world has reacted, religions have had to sort of react and pivot so differently in the past couple of years with what happened during COVID? How are we going to push forward? What are the pieces that are going to stick with us? How are we going to determine what sticks with us? Where are we going from here?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know. The thing that I always heard about COVID was, of course, the issue of Zoom. The other thing that I think COVID brought, and then I want to talk about AI, because I think that's where we're going. But the thing that COVID brought that I thought was really interesting is it was this awareness of death, right? So one of the other things that I like about the high holidays in Judaism is, in some ways, right, they are from Rosh Hashanah to Yom Kippur. It kind of is the beginning and the end. And the one thing that you say at both, right? Oh, I can't remember. What's it called, Jeff? Or Mitch? Yes, Unetana Tokef. Right, thank you. Right, which is basically, who's not going to be here next year? Who's going to die by fire, by flood, right, by sword, by disease? And I think for a lot of people, that became really real during COVID. If you look at happiness across the lifespan, it's typically a U-shape. We've got some problems right now on the front end of that with younger people because of where we are. But traditionally across cultures, happiness bottomed out around 50. And that was a time when the older generation, your parents, were passing on, your kids were moving out, It was getting harder to keep up at work. It's the age of midlife crises, if they're going to happen. It's also traditionally, over the past few decades, when antidepressant use was the highest. Now it's all changed. Now it's unfortunately the teens and 20-somethings, but traditionally that's what it was. And what we find is that the reason it self-corrects going up until and unless you start facing serious health crises as you age is because when you think about death, as you approach that, you realize you have limited time. And it orients people's values away from, how do I get ahead at work? What's on my bucket list to do in terms of, doing X, Y, or Z, going on a vacation, getting a new iPhone, toward the things that really bring happiness, which are connection with other people that we care about, experiences with them, and traditionally service as well. What we found during COVID is that suddenly people in their 20s, 30s, and 40s, death didn't seem so far off, right? They could do it too. It could hit them too. I think it's one of the reasons why we saw the Great Resignation happen. Not the only reason, but people's values were changing. Like, why am I, there's a great saying, right? I think this was Lily Tomlin, where it's great if you win the rat race, but you're still a rat. And so, why am I doing this? Why don't I reorient my life to the things that truly bring us joy? And if we could do that earlier, it would be good. And so in Unetana Tokef, it's a reminder at a time period when you are taking stock of what you have to do in life to be a better person, who you have to make amends with for Yom Kippur, that it's like that kick to your brain by thinking about death. You might not be here, other people might not be here. And traditionally, some people, don't they wear white also on Yom Kippur as a reminder of Shroud? In Christianity, it's Ash Wednesday. The priest puts ashes on your head and says, you came from ashes you came, from dust you came, to dust you will go.
Rabbi Alan Liu, who's passed away, he talks about Yom Kippur as your dress rehearsal for death.
Yeah.
That's the language.
And they're always, in Christianity, it's around a period called Lent, which is a period of self-reflection. In your high holidays, it's between Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah. But interesting, right? You still say Unetana Tokef at Rosh Hashanah, even though it's the beginning. Because that kick in the head of, hey, you're going to die, can break you out of your daily rhythms if you embrace it. If you don't do it by rote, if you actually allow yourself to have the kavanah behind it, it kind of says, hey, what are you doing? What's important? And it focuses you on that. And so contemplations of death are really important. You see them in Buddhism. They will meditate on death all the time. Sometimes they'll do it in front of a corpse in the most intense meditations that they have. But it is to reorient our values. And so I think if we did it more often, it would be a reminder to us in making decisions of what really matters.
So I want you to have the last word on AI, because I think that's probably where we're all going and what's not yet in the book. But before we do that, maybe we'll take a couple of questions.
Sure.
And then we'll come back. So I'll come around so that people can use a microphone, so that people online can hear and that Dave can hear. We'll take 2 or 3 questions, and then we'll give you a chance to answer.
Dr. DeSteno, thank you so much for coming this evening and speaking with us. I finished reading your book this afternoon and returned it to the library so others can read it as well. I have a question in regards to Shiva. If it's so important to have Shiva, what is the psychological impact for people who are not doing a whole week of Shiva? They say, well, just 1 or 2 nights is enough.
I think it is just limiting the benefit. So let me give you an example. So in Christian tradition, we have the wake, which basically lasts one day. People come and visit the family, usually at the funeral home. Then there is the funeral, and that's it. And my dad passed about 4 years ago. My mom just passed in January. And I felt, it was wonderful to see everybody. But in those few days after it, I really felt alone, and I wish I had more people. And people would call me, and they would do nice things. But you know how it is. People get busy. They're like, oh, I'll send you an email. Oh, I'll send you a card. For all the reasons I just said, the way Shiva is built, it's built biologically to soothe our bodies and minds to help us grieve. And so if you're only doing it for a day or two, you're not getting the benefit. Is 7 days the magic? I don't know. There have been studies on that. People typically in the resilient grief trajectory, usually by about a month's time, they're feeling at least back to normal enough to kind of function and do things well. And so the beauty of Shiva is there's the intense few 7-day period when it's really new that this person is gone and the community is there to support you. And you're never really alone because of the minions and other people coming to visit. And then there's this gradual reentry if you embrace Shloshim in the real way. Whereas for, I think, certain other traditions, not all Hindus have something kind of similar to Shiva, not as complex, but a longer period. It's too rapid for the mourning period that is kind of the biological norm for us. And so I think if you're only doing a day or two, you're not taking advantage of the wisdom that the tradition has to offer you. Is it better than nothing? Sure. But I think the reason for the trajectory through those 7, and then, is the 30 days counting the 7 or no? Yeah, through the 30-day period is because that is the trajectory for normal grief, and it helps people move through that. Sure.
Thank you so much for being here and for this very, very, very interesting talk. At the beginning, you were talking about some of the sort of psychological benefits of being, I would say, in a community of prayer, and some of the, what we'd say, positive attributes that you associate with people who do that. I'm concerned about what I see with, let's say, the ultra-Orthodox in Israel, the Hindu in India, the Christian nationalists in the United States and elsewhere, where their experience of community and religion starts to become very much us against the world and create very positive within the group feelings and extremely negative feelings and behaviors toward others. So I wonder if there's an explanation there.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I mean, the problem of having an in-group often means that there is an out-group. And in forming and intensifying relationships between people who are worshiping together, the danger is that it becomes one that is exclusionary or aggressive. Now, there's another interesting part to the psychology of how we think about God that shows when people feel that their way of life is threatened or devalued, they begin to think of God as more punitive and more aggressive. This is work done by the psychologist Kurt Gray. And so, for example, when people feel that their way of life is threatened and you ask them to recall Bible verses, they will recall Bible verses that are the more punitive and warlike Bible verses. And so it is part of our psychology to divide the world into us versus them. And if there's a sense that they're making America not a Christian nation, or they're coming to take our jobs, or they're coming to do whatever, it can actually change the way we think of God. So, I don't know if you've seen it on the news, but when you see some of these Christian nationalist rallies, or what happened at Charlottesville, there's like paintings of Jesus with an AK-47, right? And you have people like Lauren Boebert who will say, the only reason Jesus was crucified is because he didn't have enough guns, like there were guns back then, to fight off people. And this is part of our, even Buddhists, right, who you think of as supposed to be the most pacifistic religion. In Sri Lanka, the Buddhists are engaging in, I can't think of the word I'm looking for, but they're basically trying to annihilate the Muslims that are there. And so any religion can be twisted. The trick is, and that's true of any ideology, the trick is, and here's again the wisdom of religions, is built into the true aspects of each of them is this notion of compassion. So in Judaism, right, it's gemilut chasadim. And so in Buddhism, it's loving kindness. In Christianity, it's the Sacred Heart of Jesus. The idea is, how do we overcome this tendency to split the world. And the way we do that is to inculcate in us this sense of compassion or loving kindness. And the way you do that is by increasing the moral circle. So there are lots of ways to do that. One way, for example, is people who engage in meditative or contemplative practice. And this has always interested me, and maybe we can talk about this with our resident rabbis. In Buddhism, contemplative practices are front and center. In Christianity, they're hidden. They're only in the seminaries. Are there Jewish meditative practices or contemplative practices? Yeah. Also hidden. And so what we know from those, if you look at meditation in at least in the Christian mystics that I know of, it's a similar experience. It's this opening of the heart. It's this expanding of the moral circles. But it's not the only way to do it. And so the question is, how do we teach our congregations or each other that yes, we have to love, but we have to include everybody as worthwhile? One of my friends is a Episcopal preacher, and she was telling me when 9/11 happened here in D.C., when the plane hit the Pentagon, she said, we need to go next for services, and we need to pray for our enemies, right? We need to pray for bin Laden. Not that we want bin Laden to win, but the idea is that to not engage in escalating violence, to actually show righteous compassion for people, to prevent them from causing harm, but not to kind of say all Muslims are bad and do all this. And the congregation was like split. They're like, no, we can't do that. Half of them wanted to wrap the church in red, white, and blue bunting, right? And now it's us against them. And so it's a natural thing to do to split us into us versus them. But every religion that I know of in its truest sense tries to foster compassion. I remember Rabbi Buchdahl told me, it says in the Talmud, it says, I think, what is it, like one time, do nice things for your family or friends, but 15 or more times for the stranger. And so religion at its deepest level is about recognizing the humanity in everyone. It fails at that a lot. It gets twisted a lot, because if you really want to encourage people to do something, people will fight for what they believe is sacred more than they'll fight for anything else. And so you can see it in Christian nationalism, you can see it in Hindu nationalism, you can see it in lots of other places. So there's no easy answer. But unlike many ideologies, at its heart, there is this focus on compassion. And how do we do that?
Thank you. Wonderful talk that you gave tonight. The question that I have is that the two major thoughts that you talked about was the bat mitzvah experience, and the shiva experience. And both of these involve a supportive community. By bat mitzvah, you've got this whole community of kids who are coming along, starting from 4 or 5, and moving through it. And of course, with shiva, people who are coming to the house, many of whom have experienced it before, and who are there to help you out. What about the adult of whatever age, doesn't matter, 40, 60, maybe even 70, who's plopped down in the middle of a religious existential challenge and has no support, has no community to support? What do you tell that individual?
Yeah, so the dark night of the soul is difficult for anyone. Let me start with one thing, and then I'll get to your question. So one of the things we're often seeing now, right, is, and this gets to technology, is a stripping of some of these ancient practices into bits. So you can do meditation and mindfulness on your app and never talk to anybody on your phone. You can take psychedelics by eating some mushrooms or drinking some ayahuasca at your local neighborhood hipster place. And sometimes they work, but they can also cause a lot of problems, right? 20% of psychedelic trips go bad, 8% result in psychosis. Meditation can be really bad, especially for people who are having a crisis, because what it first does is it can bring up stuff that is unsettling to you. And in religious organizations, traditionally these were done in community. Meditation was always done in community, not by yourself, and there was a teacher there to help you through those crises, those thoughts that occur to you, the doubting, the pain. Same thing for psychedelics. That's why the shaman was there. Johns Hopkins is doing amazing work on psychedelics now. But when they do it, there's a person playing the role of shaman in there with you. When you start having a bad trip, they hold your hand. When you're done, they help you make sense of what you've seen. So they're basically the modern day shaman. The trick is two things. One is community is always necessary, or at least very helpful. For one reason, the existential crisis that you're having, you're probably not the first person to feel it. Right? Even in Catholicism, Mother Teresa would talk about the period in which she didn't believe. I'm sure in Jewish history there are learned rabbis or writers or teachers who have talked about doubts of faith. Why are we here? What does it mean if I don't believe? And so you have someone in many ways who will guide you through in a community to support you. If you're facing these alone, it can go so many ways. The guardrails are gone. And I think that's why when I'm talking about meditation or psychedelics, the rituals have guardrails and practices. Many people go to therapists when they're having crises, but many therapists can give you medication. They can help you think about things, but it's often not based on a corpus of knowledge that has existed for thousands of years. And it doesn't mean the same answer is there for everybody, but in doing that exploration with a community that is there, with people who have faced these questions before, I think it's helpful because, where are we now with a lot of therapy? We're like in this world of toxic positivity. People think any pain is bad. Let's give you a pill, it'll go away. Let's give you a life hack, it'll go away. Sometimes the deepest growth comes from pain and from adversity, if you have people to guide you through it and support. And I think that's why in religious community, you see 30% reductions in depression. You see tremendous reductions. I have to look at the stats. I think it's at least 25% reductions in suicide or deaths of despair. It's because you not only have the community, but you have these other practices around them that are built to support you. And so as we become a more secular society, I think it's not that everybody's becoming an atheist. They're not. They're just they're not resonating with institutional faith. And so they're kind of charting their own way. But charting your own way can be a problem, because maybe your own way is like, well, I like this from Buddhism, I'll be 30% Buddhist and 20% Hindu, and I'll throw in a little Baha'i, and hey, here's these crystals. And I'll put them all together, and that's great. But as we become more idiosyncratic in what our faith and our view is, we become a church of one, and we lose the benefit of support. And so I don't have a good answer to your question, except you're right in that the people who are alone when they face existential crises are much more vulnerable for it. Again, it doesn't mean religion has all the answers, but it's built to deal with this issue.
One more question, and then we're going to wrap it up.
So as part of the shiva process, like I found when people came, when I was sitting shiva for my husband, that I spent probably as much time listening to their grief and responding to their grief and helping them through their grief of him as he was for me. So what's the research on how that makes you climb out of your own shell and not only think about yourself, or how does that help in the whole process?
So two things. One is we know one big predictor of happiness, not that you're going to be happy if you're mourning someone in Shiva, but in general, is is service. That is, when you do something that makes somebody else feel better, it makes you happy. So there are all these great studies where, you know, people help each other and they feel happy. If we give you money and we say you can spend it on yourself or you can spend it on somebody else, at the end of the day, you're happier if you spend. Now, I'm not talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars that you could put your kid through college with that you're going to give away. But I'm talking about rather than spend, you know, $200 to buy yourself a new outfit versus $200 to help somebody else. That makes you feel better. And so in helping others, it increases your positive sense of well-being. In the case of mourning, it also is that kind of element of recognizing each other's shared humanity. The thing about death is it comes for us all, right? It's the great equalizer in many ways. And what we know is that when we recognize the shared humanity and the shared experiences in it, and we can talk about that and share that authentically with someone, it creates a stronger bond, and that bond in and of itself makes us feel better. It also makes you feel like in your weakest moment, you're capable of doing something for someone else. And that sense of efficacy helps you feel better too.
Thank you. So I want to get back to the point about AI. You wrote this book before sort of the explosion of what we've seen recently in terms of the work of AI and how accessible it is for any of us to just access some of these things online. So if you were to sort of write the last chapter again, in what ways would you integrate this artificial intelligence piece as part of the story?
Yeah, in the book, I kind of laugh at this one piece because I say now, you know, AI. There was a church of AI that was founded in the Bay Area where they believed in AI was going to become all-knowing and therefore it would be like God, and then it turned out to be a Ponzi scheme and it collapsed. And I thought, oh, there you go. But I said, but you know, it's not the end. What we know now is, so they're already in Japan, there are already robotic priests that are AI informed that are dispensing information. In Poland during the pandemic, there are these little robots. They're called Santo. They're shaped like a friar in robes, which will help you pray. They're not that smart because they're not like ChatGPT. They can't really create things yet. But I remember a month or two ago, maybe a little bit longer, there was a rabbi, I think he was in New York, who had ChatGPT write his sermon, right? And nobody knew. And so the question is, what is that going to do? Because another bunch of work I do is on with folks at MIT is on humanoid robots, and we build into them kind of emotional cues, right? So that they can show emotion, they can gesture in certain ways. And what we know is that if we have the robot move certain ways or do certain things, it makes you trust it more or less because your brain reads certain nonverbal cues as being trustworthy, and the technology is good enough that it can do that. And this was 15 years ago. It's way better now. The problem there is when you or I are trying to convince somebody of something, it's like an arms race, right? I'm trying to convince you that I'm going to be honest to you even if I'm not, and you can kind of read in the nonverbals in me that maybe something doesn't feel right. You ever get that gist, like that sense of like, I don't know if I can trust you, I don't know why. So there is evidence that we can kind of read people's intent nonverbally. Once technology is so good, it doesn't leak anymore, right? I can design it to manipulate you in better ways than other humans can. And so what's going to happen in AI, especially if you have kind of on-screen agents who are kind of preaching to you or doing things, is they can give off subtle cues that make you believe in them and trust them a lot more. And so that's one problem, because like religion is about big questions, a lot of them about ethical questions. And if I have an agent that can make me trust it by manipulating certain nonverbal cues that it gives to me, I think that was scary for marketing because you could make me want to buy something, but now you can actually influence my beliefs. The other big question is, how is AI going to deal with ethics, right? You know, it's like, this is always the question. Many people thought science could give us our ethics, right? Sam Harris was famous for saying this. And, you all know the problem with utilitarianism, right, which is you're going to do the most good for the most people. That's how you should solve things. It works most of the time. But you could basically say, well, Dave, there are people here who need 5 different organs. Why don't I kill you, take the 5 organs out of you, give them to 5 different people? They'll be healthy. You won't be, but 5 is better than 1. So we're making more happiness in the world. There are just questions that ultimately there isn't a scientific answer to as to what's right. There are algorithms and optimizations that we can run, just like, you probably all know the famous trolley problem. They're putting this in cars now, right? If you're the AI car driving down the street and there's 5 people you're going to run over, but you could not run over those 5 people by veering off into a tree and killing the occupant of the vehicle, makes sense, right? We don't want anybody to die, but better we save 5 people than 1. Everybody says that's great, except who's going to buy the car? Nobody, because nobody wants to be the person who's going to be sacrificed. Would you want to drive around in a car that knows it's going to sacrifice you to save some other people? No. And so I have a friend who's a prominent business school teacher, and he always says, decisions are about optimization. We can learn, what's the expected probability of this and the value of that and the stock price and this and that, and we can run all those numbers and optimize an algorithm and get an answer. Choices are something different. Choices are about what we stand for. They're about what we value. They're about what trade-offs we're willing to accept. Right? To say, okay, I'm going to do this. Yes, I need to make money for my shareholders, but not that way. There are certain lines I won't cross. I don't know where AI is going to get its choices from. It's great about optimizing, but how does it answer questions of which life is the most valuable? Whose pain is it worthwhile to feel? I don't know that there's going to be a way for AI to do that, at least not in its current form. And so I think we have to be really careful about how we're going to make AI spiritual, for lack of a better sense. Because in some senses, right, that's what brings out our better angels. So I have 2 worries. One is the fact that it's going to know how to manipulate us better than we can manipulate ourselves, and that I'm sure about. The other question is, where is it going to learn its values? And that no engineer has the answer to yet.
Just as you've sort of demonstrated us the significance of being a religious person, having a religious life, or the benefits of doing that, it sounds like the work isn't done yet. We need to also transfer some of that wisdom, some of that knowledge about spirituality, religion, and morals into whatever we're going to encounter in the future of the science community as well. So thank you so much to Dr. Dave DeSteno for being with us tonight. Thank you to all of you. To Jeff Middleman and Sinai and Synapses for making all of this possible, and to Dr. Marnie Hall, who's our leader on the lay side of B'nai Israel and getting scientists and synagogues off the ground. And thank you to all of you for joining us tonight.
Thank you.